welcome everyone to the Jazz Education Station. My name is Ryan Ashworth. I'm your host. Today's guest is Jocelyn Gould. Jocelyn is a jazz guitarist based out of Toronto. In 2018, she won first place in the Wilson International Jazz Competition. She's performed at numerous jazz festivals in the US and abroad. She is featured on several recordings and maintains an active performing career. Her new album, Elegant Traveler, was released in March of 2020 and is available for purchase and streaming. In August of 2019, Jocelyn began a professorship at Humber College in Toronto as a professor of guitar, and she is also a Benedetto endorsed artist. I'm incredibly excited to have her on the show today, and so please welcome Jocelyn.
Thank you for having me, Ryan.
Oh, yeah. I'm so glad that we could make this happen. So, Jocelyn, the way that we're going to kind of do things is I'm going to open up the first part of the show with some questions for you. So if you don't mind, we'll jump right in.
Sounds great.
Cool. All right, so the first question I have for you is one that I ask everybody who's on the show, and that's what are some current trends in jazz education that you've noticed within the last 5 years?
I thought long and hard about this. You sent out a few questions to think about previously, and I at first was like, well, for starters, I just started teaching in September. So as a jazz educator, although it's been something I've wanted to do for a long time, I'm very, very new, about 8 months in. So I was sort of like, well, what trends are there? But I started my undergrad in 2009. So I have been involved in jazz education kind of over the past decade, doing my undergrad and master's. I think I came up with I had a few thoughts on this. For starters, it sort of feels like jazz education, and I guess I'm speaking more specifically post-secondary education.
Oh, sure.
It seems to be, I feel like it's becoming a more accepted and almost more kind of classic path to take en route to becoming a professional jazz musician. I imagine, and I've kind of read when, jazz education was sort of becoming a thing in post-secondary education, that it was not necessarily still something that serious young musicians would have thought, oh, this is absolutely something that I should do. I think it might have been more the trend, and sort of historically, jazz has been a mentored music. You find yourself a mentor on your instrument or not on your instrument, and you follow them and learn from them and develop a career that way. And now I think kind of the universities or colleges have kind of become the place where young musicians are meeting their mentors and are developing those relationships with masters of music. And I think that for professional musicians, education has kind of trended towards just being a part of the gig. The world's best musicians are doing residencies at universities or at schools. And so just sort of seeing education and the institution sort of like integrate itself into the traditional sort of path for a jazz musician, which I think has pros and cons in terms of, you have to be able to pay for education. And so maybe some people are definitely, I'm sure people get cut out that way if they can't, you want to study music but can't, necessarily afford to go to a school they would like to go to. But in a way, I think that jazz education has become the new patron sort of for the music. So that was sort of one thought that I had, just sort of in education's kind of integration into, it's always been important, back to Dizzy Gillespie and the kind of famous jazz educators of the music's history. And yeah, I think sort of formal education has worked its way into that as well. Another thought that I had as I was thinking about this more was just in terms of, I feel like jazz education is trending to be more inclusive and more open to kind of people of different demographics that would like to study. When I started my undergrad in 2009, I was the only female guitarist to have ever been in my program. And now, just a short 10 years later, I had like 10 girls audition on guitar this year.
Wow.
To be in the program that I teach in, which just brought me so much joy. And to see just to see jazz education trending into a more gender diverse and just all around diverse world, I think is a really nice trend as well.
Awesome. Fantastic. Very, very, very well put. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As a matter of fact, the school that I teach at here in Chicago, we got a grant through an organization called Little Kids Rock, and they provide musical instruments for public schools. And one of the things that they illustrate is something that you just kind of touched on, which is that, you know, jazz music, as far as the education is concerned, and even the performance and inclusion of it in public schools, is like a jazz band, you know, in junior high and high school, or when you start playing an instrument, to have an opportunity to focus on American music and learn how to improvise in that tradition. That was a fringe thing that almost had to be justified and kind of forced in either before school or after school if you wanted to do the jazz band. Your other option, you had to do marching band or whatever the case may be. So not only at the post-secondary level, but even at the, you know, at the high school level and stuff like that, to see jazz music take its place in the education world so that everybody that wants to has an opportunity to learn how to improvise on their instrument is really pretty cool. So
yes, it's awesome.
yeah. Well, very, very well put. And the next question that I have for you is, if you could only listen to 5 albums for the rest of your life, which 5 albums would you choose?
This was very, very difficult. And of course, the first sort of, I mean, I just can never, I'm like a broken record, which is no pun intended with this record, is Smoking at the Half Note, Wes Montgomery.
Yeah, Wynton Kelly, that album's killer.
Totally. It's, and I just feel like it's just like the music and jazz guitar just on a platter, just like put out. It's just like, for me, just a perfect example of the type of guitar that I would like to be playing, of, you know, what there is to strive for. I just love that record so much. And then I struggled with the next 4. So I thought, I mean, probably I would want some Miles first grade quintet. So probably, you know, Steamin', Workin', Relaxin', those records.
Yeah.
Those are perfect records. I would probably want Sonny Rollins at the Village Vanguard.
Okay.
And I think some Duke Ellington. I wasn't able to come to a conclusion on what Duke Ellington I would pick, but I don't think I could go the rest of my life without Duke Ellington.
Gotcha.
And maybe like Bird with Strings.
Cool.
Yeah, it's very tough to narrow it down to 5. Or like Sonny Rollins +4 with Clifford Brown. Yeah, I basically was like, what records have like the most influential people on them so I can take more than 5 people?
Right, and that's the idea, you know, that's the reason that I asked this question to everybody, because you know, we're going to get a different 5 answers every time that are also going to give people the opportunity to see who influenced you, and then they have an opportunity to dig into that and then branch out from there, because now more than ever we have so much at our fingertips, you know. And that kind of ties into our last question. as far as education is concerned, those people who can't afford, maybe get excluded from the post-secondary institutions because of a lack of affordability. If you have the drive, you can you could even look up the coursework in today's world. You could look up every text that's being used for the courses that you would be taking, and
Yeah,
you could order that textbook and the workbook that you would be working through. And if you have the drive, you could almost complete the same course on your own, and get the same education. So yeah, that's pretty cool that the internet gives people the opportunity. I get to hear what 5 albums you like, and then I can go look those up. You see what I'm saying? So that's the reason that I want to give these questions to folks.
that makes
So
sense.
great answers.
Thank you.
Uh, next question. This is one that will probably bring a little controversy
Hmm.
as far as answers are concerned, which is the do's and don'ts of what are some do's and don'ts of transcribing in your opinion? Because everybody's going to say, well, when you transcribe, do this and don't do this, and then you talk to someone else and they say, well, no, man, you need to do this and not this, right?
Definitely.
Take it
I
away.
mean, I mean, this is like opening a whole, this is a question that I feel like everybody's like, finally, I get to talk about this on the internet.
Sweet.
um, I think the main thing, and something that I'm trying to implement with myself and with my students, is that um, basically with something like transcribing, just being very, very critical of what you're doing and deciding what you want ultimate like what are you trying to get out of transcribing, it is, I think, a really important thing to ask yourself before you even come up with your process. So for me, and what I think is the ultimate goal, or for me the ultimate goal of transcribing, is to integrate language and integrate elements of playing from musicians that I love into my own playing.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I think that once you've realized your ultimate goal, then you're not going about doing it blindly. You have a goal in place. So I just transcribed Freddie Hubbard on One Finger Snap. And so for me, it's like the ultimate thing is I want to integrate Freddie Hubbard's language into my playing, and his rhythms and his sound, and all the sort of elements of Freddie Hubbard's playing. So the first thing I did was transcribe the entire solo, and learn to play it up to tempo and along with Freddie Hubbard. And the reason that I think that this is valuable is, as first of all, to play a solo from one of the masters from start to finish, you really get to feel what it feels like to go through those motions and to go through the process of, okay, I started the solo from start to finish. You get to feel what it feels like technically to play at that level. You get to feel the arc of the solo, and I think those are really important and valuable things to take from transcription. But I think that learning to play solo front to back and just playing it, and that's about, I think, half of the work.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I learned to play a solo front to back, if I just do that with this Freddie Hubbard solo and walk away, I will never probably play a single one of those lines in my actual improvising. And so something that took me a long time to figure out, and that I just wish I had been able to do sooner and had kind of valued sooner, is then the rest of the process, the second half of the process for me, is breaking the solo up into small pieces of language or small pieces of rhythm, and taking those through 12 keys, and then forcing them into my own improvisations over whatever tune it is that I happen to be shedding. And if I don't do that for a really long time, then it's almost like the rest has been futile, like I've just sort of wasted my time. And another thing that I've really learned is that it takes such a long time. It just takes annoyingly and frustratingly long sometimes to integrate new stuff into your playing. And so for me, with this solo that I just learned, when I start breaking it into smaller bits, which I started doing yesterday, I probably won't start seeing that in my playing until like truly organically seeing it in my playing until like the end of the summer, maybe, if I work at it like consistently. And
Hmm.
so I think for me, the big thing is to remember to just be patient with a solo, and to sit with a solo for months even. And um, learning 5 solos in a month for me doesn't get me to the same place as if I take a truly masterful solo and sit with it for several months and really break it up and try to learn. And then once I do have a phrase that I've really integrated, start to try and you know um, mess with, like, change it. How can I kind of get into it in different ways? How can I resolve in different ways? How can I place it kind of differently in the harmonic rhythm? So yeah, that's something that I've done way too much of, is just learn a solo and like throw it up online and kind of pat myself on the back and walk away and never reap any of the benefits of the work that I've done because I only went halfway that way.
That's funny. I always tell people a story about. Are you familiar with the Joe Pass album "Catch Me"?
Yes.
So, what tune was it? I think it was "Just Friends." His solo on "Just Friends." So I spent an enormous amount of time transcribing that solo. All right, I used slow downer software, and I worked my tail off with that solo. Got it down, and I could play it at tempo. And just like you said, I worked so hard and broke it down. And I was like, oh my god, what is it? Was I was punching so high up, right? I was batting so far out of my league that at the end of it, I finished it, and I was like, all right, I finished this solo. I can play this solo that Joe Pass played. I am physically capable of executing that on the instrument with Joe Pass in real time, right? Just like you said, pat on the back. Good job. But, I was talking with another jazz guitarist in Philadelphia at the time, and he said, all right, yeah, all right, you did that. And this was all in good. He was coming from a good place. And he said, okay, but I want you to, after you take that final chorus of his solo, I want you to continue that momentum on your own. All right. Whenever, after you leave Joe Pass's solo, I want you to continue that momentum with your own playing ability. Right. And so I realized, like, okay, I didn't actually get the most out of it. Just like you just said, I only did half of the work. And then the next part of that, the breaking it down and including that into your own language, that's just like you said, a whole nother ball game. So I completely relate. That was an excellent answer, and people are going to get a lot from that, I think.
Oh, cool. That's such a cool thought. I have never tried doing that. Kind of just like continuing soloing after.
Right, especially Joe Pass when he's burning. So,
Right. Yes.
which, I guess that also ties into, if you're on the bandstand and somebody's really, really on fire, and you're like, all right, now, now it's my turn. All right, here we go. Which is one thing that, and this is just another, almost me just rambling at this point, but, another thing that you learn from that is at the end of their solo, if they've been burning, it's your opportunity to reset, reset
Mhm.
so that you can build from there. Anyway,
Yeah.
so next question for you is, what are you practicing these days?
Well, I am transcribing is a pretty big part of what I do. Um, for me, and again, I could talk about my practice routine for
Please.
forever. For me, I'm always just trying to figure out what do I want? Like what am I trying to get out of sitting down for so many hours every day? Like, what do I actually want the result to be? I used to sort of, I think I've gone through periods where for me, just sitting down and practicing was enough. And I got a lot of fulfillment out of being like, well, I practice 4 hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't that awesome? But I feel like I wasn't actually using that time to get to actually improve my playing. It was almost like the goal was to practice, not the goal was to improve
Right.
on my instrument. And so I think like this was over 3 years ago now. I was really frustrated with my practice routine, and I sat down and made a list of everything that I want to get better at. Just like I want to get better at playing the blues. I want to improve my bebop language. I want my eighth note feel to improve. I want to get better at solo guitar. I want to, and it was just like, I want to get better at up tempo. I want to get better at slow tempos. I want to, start to incorporate maybe some more McCoy Tyner type pentatonic language into my playing. I want like just all of these things that I wanted to do. And it was like a full page. And then I said, okay, well, realistically, how many hours in a day do I have? And I was doing my master's at this time. And so I came up with, I have 4 hours a day. Like if I'm actually being serious, I could get up and practice for 2 hours before classes and then practice for 2 hours after classes. That's not unrealistic.
Right.
So then I split it into 4-hour-long chunks. The first hour was I called fundamentals, and I practiced things like my scales and my arpeggios. And I struggle with that kind of stuff because I have never felt like practicing my major scales up and down have ever really benefited me all that much. And sort of just trying to figure out, okay, well, how can I practice scales in a way that actually will make me a better improviser? So I started so I switched from practicing scales to practicing sounds, sitting on just like playing indefinitely on a major scale, using scales, arpeggios, and enclosures, and then sitting on a minor scale for 10 minutes, or a minor chord, I mean, for 10 minutes and doing the same thing, and a dominant chord for 10 minutes and doing the same thing. And so the first hour was filled with things like that, like 6 things that I did for 10 minutes. And the second hour was just learning tunes and reviewing tunes. And this is all just me at my best self too. This is,
I understand.
When I'm at my best, I'm keeping a really careful log of what tunes I know and when the last time I reviewed them was.
Wow.
So going through the second hour would be going half an hour reviewing tunes that I've learned before, and half an hour learning new tunes that I never had learned. And then the third hour was transcription. And I was doing 2 types. I was doing a half-hour solo guitar, pretty much exclusively Joe Pass. So half-hour transcribing Joe Pass playing solo, and then a half-hour transcribing some type of linear solo, be it Sonny Rollins or whoever. And then the fourth hour was called other stuff, and I would work on intros and endings. That's a huge thing for me.
I'm glad you said that.
It's hard. It's like, so I was like, okay, I have to have, it's all like, I'm just always trying to move everything in a direction of actually being able to walk on the bandstand and like be better. So I dedicate some of my time to learning intros and learning endings just off records, just so that I can start a tune and end a tune, which often is the place that I think people struggle.
Right.
And blues, I like to dedicate time to blues. to slow tempos, up tempos. So the last hour is just for practical challenges, like challenges that I face on the bandstand and sight reading, things that I'm going to need to be able to do when I walk on the bandstand.
Gotcha.
So that's
Very
my routine. The last 8
cool.
months have been challenging to get 4 hours a day in, but now the classes are ending. I'm hoping to just move forward with that.
Yeah, I'm with you. The way I've been navigating it, because I'm obligated to be at the computer so much, just kind of have guitar on hand, and I have things that I'm working on. And so if I have some downtime, and just like you said, I think any busy person can find, if your goal is to really get some work done musically, everybody has 4 hours if you can find a way to be, really good with your time and block it out. So
Definitely. Yeah, um, and then once you get used to it, it becomes it's daunting at first when you haven't if you're going from no practicing ever to practicing 4 hours a day. It's daunting, but once you get used to it, it just becomes your lifestyle, and
and
yeah.
quarantine is second nature. And
Yes. Yeah,
what do you
exactly.
mean? What do you mean? Practicing. So cool. So my last question for you, actually, I couldn't decide which one. So maybe we could tie these together, because this is kind of like my surprise question for you.
Hmm.
Which is number one, what's it like being a Benedetto endorsed guitarist? What was kind of like the process of winding up with your own Benedetto instrument? And then I'm curious about a couple of maybe of specs on that Benedetto guitar after you kind of talk about the process of going through, how you wound up becoming endorsed by Benedetto. I'm sure that a lot of people would love to hear about how that came about. And then
Yes.
after that, I was going to ask you what your favorite ending is. Like, how, what out of all of the endings, because it's like, oh, I like the Augie 4, I like the this, I like the that. Like, what is your favorite ending? So maybe we could talk about the Benedetto guitar, how that came about. Then we could wrap up the Q&A part with your favorite ending, and then we can kind of open it up more for you to talk about whatever it is that you want to discuss.
Definitely.
Cool.
Okay, Benedetto. Well, I did my master's degree at Michigan State University and studied with this great guitarist named Randy Napoleon. Um, and Randy, I just graduated from my master's 2 years ago, so it's all still pretty recent.
I just played a gig with a guy named Christopher Barrick, who now I believe is at Michigan State. Right before moving to Chicago, I played. He was a saxophone professor at a university in Arkansas, and we had a jazz jam going on because I briefly went back to Arkansas, and so he was about to relocate to go to Michigan State to have something to do with the music faculty there. So that's interesting that you kind of just transition from there. And this guy, shout out Christopher Barrick, which I'm hoping to have on the show in the not too distant future.
Very cool. Oh, that's
Yeah, yeah,
awesome.
yeah. Sorry to interrupt your answer. I apologize.
Oh no, that's so great. It's like anybody who's gone to MSU is family.
Oh, cool.
It's a
I,
really like deep program.
another guy who I'm pretty sure went to Michigan State. His name's Michael Hanna. He's another fantastic saxophone player. One of my musical brothers, who at some point I will also have on the show. He got his master's at a university in Michigan, and I'm pretty sure Michigan State. So
Very cool. Oh, that's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
Yeah. That was, I mean, um, moving to Michigan from Canada and being so close to Detroit
Mm-hmm.
and just being so close to such a deep musical history and um, up in Canada, and especially I'm from Winnipeg, Canada, so like really the middle of nowhere, central Canada.
Gotcha.
Um, it's not like swing is not like it's just not the sound of the culture. It's like Joni Mitchell grew up like basically down the street from me, so that's sort of the real sound of the culture. Neil Young, that kind of stuff, which is amazing music. um
Pat Metheny did some cool stuff with Joni Mitchell.
oh yeah, she's so incredible.
Yeah.
um So for me, when I moved to, this is going to be a long story leading
Please
to
hit me with it. We have nothing but time. There's no time limit here. So by all means.
Awesome. Um, so for me, moving to listening to when I got into jazz and started listening to the records, for me it was sort of like the sound um, of African American music, and for me it was removed from like my immediate kind of the music of my culture and what I'd grown up with. And so
Sure.
when I got to move to Michigan, be, in Detroit, just an hour away from Detroit and in Detroit basically every night, it was the first time that I felt that I was sort of like really in the music
Mm.
and in a place where like this was the language, this was the culture, and like of that city, like this was the music of that city. And that was like massively a huge pedagogical time for me, just learning like what it's like to truly um like be a part of the music. And so I was studying with a guitar player named Randy Napoleon, who teaches at MSU, who's from Michigan, and we got super close. He became basically like my big brother of the guitar.
Mm.
We just talked yesterday, actually, so we're still like, he's still. We had like a 45-minute conversation about solo guitar yesterday. So he sort of, for starters, really imparted on me what mentorship really is, in terms of being an invested mentor. One really cool thing about that area, about MSU, and it seems like Detroit musical culture, is that being a mentor is kind of like the highest regarded thing.
Mm.
Like it's great to be able to play. It's great to be able to be one of the great players. But if you're not passing that on to the next generation, then what really is the value?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we got super close, and he is a Benedetto endorsed artist.
Mm.
And so he started sending me on, like, I would sub for him on gigs I got to play with. He sent me to Atlanta to sub for him with Freddie Cole, Nat King Cole's brother.
Oh, wow.
And so just like huge learning experiences for me. When I moved to New York when I finished at MSU, I moved straight to New York, and it just was really cool to learn how, just how powerful a mentor can be. A lot of people I would meet, they would be like, "Oh, Randy told me about you," you know?
Gotcha. Yeah.
And so he was talking to Benedetto, kind of saying, I've got this student who is, really serious about trying to learn how to play guitar. And so he put me on their radar.
Mm.
And just a few like really kind of serendipitous things have happened, like winning that competition, which was in Milwaukee actually.
Okay.
And just getting this becoming the head of the guitar department at Humber, and all of these sort of things just kind of happened in a short period of time. And it was actually kind of a moment. It was, I think, like July 7th last year. I got 2 emails in 5 minutes in a
Wow.
period of 5 minutes. The first email was that I had, as a Canadian, to live in the States, you have to apply for a visa.
Sure.
And especially under the current administration, they're getting harder and harder to obtain.
Mm.
And I didn't have money for a lawyer, so I did the whole thing myself,
Wow.
which was pretty risky, just like, because I'm not a lawyer. I didn't know really what I was doing, but so I just did it to the best of my ability. So the first email that I got was that I had been issued an O1 visa, which means that I can be in the States for 3 years.
Good for you. Congratulations.
Thank you. So that was very exciting. So I was like jumping around, like, thank you, like so happy that
Yeah.
I don't have to leave the States. And the second one, like 4 minutes later, I got an email from Benedetto saying, like, we would love to work with you and
Wow.
start a relationship.
That is
So I
amazing.
went. It was like there have been moments like that throughout the last several years, especially, where like things just kind of condense themselves into these moments of just like explosive like joy. Things just like a bunch of amazing things will happen in a very short period of time, and I feel like that's how music is. You struggle for months and months and months, and you just like are like, oh, and then one day you're like, suddenly you get a call from somebody.
Right. It's almost the way that I kind of put that into my own language is when you keep your eye on the prize long enough and you put in the work, it's almost inevitable that eventually those two kind of work themselves out as long as you continue to practice like that creative mindset. As long as you're trying to, you have your eye on a prize and you're putting in the necessary work to get from A to B. Most of the time, that thing is going to have its time. It's just you have to also recognize it when it's happening. So
Definitely. Yeah. And so I actually flew down there to Savannah, which is where Benedetto have their shop.
mhm.
Um, the next week, I was like, well, why don't I come down, and like, it's only a couple $100 flight, so I can just fly down and hang out. So I went down there, and it was just an immediate, just amazing fit. And they're some of just like the nicest, most passionate people about guitars and about jazz guitar and quality instruments and just being a community. And yeah, so I left with the guitar that I have.
So did they, as far as did you try out different, maybe like taper necks, and did they give you any options as far as maybe electronic preferences that you might have preferred, fret sizes, stuff like that? Details?
Yeah, so they have a whole room of guitars, that they have made that have not been that they haven't made like for any specific order.
Hmm.
um, and so I basically just got to they set me loose in that room, and I just tried a bunch of guitars. And the other option was to have an instrument kind of made, like from scratch, with like specifically for me in mind.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
um, but I'm not a very patient person, so I was like, no, I want a guitar today.
I want to leave with the instrument today. Yeah,
Exactly.
I
Like,
hear you.
I'm not waiting 8 months.
Yeah, right. I hear you. Cool.
So
Do you happen to know what kind of pickup is in your instrument? Like which brand is in the instrument?
I'm gonna just grab it. It's just right over there.
Cool.
So this is it. This is the second time in a week that I've been asked this live on the internet and not
Oh,
known.
cool. Ha.
We tried a few bits. So I'm just not the best with like memorizing specs. But we tried several pickups, and I was like, this one sounds great. Let's
Gotcha.
this one. So I'll need to I knew at one point, and now I just forget the model name. But yeah, this is the instrument.
It's beautiful.
Thank you. I'm really happy with it. I had never had like a blonde, like just natural.
I love natural finish is my favorite. my first really high quality jazz guitar that I got was like a 1980 Gibson ES-175, and it was
Oh,
natural finish. And that guitar just like played itself. It was crazy. Like it really was one of those things where you plug it in and you get the sound. But I don't. That's unimportant in comparison to the instrument that we're talking about. So is that the guitar that you used on your recording, Elegant Traveler?
yes, yep, this is it.
Cool.
And that was also a big reason why I had this recording coming up just a couple months later.
Gotcha.
And well, if I'm gonna, you know, be a Benedetto artist, then I want my Benedetto to be on the record.
Sure, sure. Yeah.
So yeah, so
Nice.
yep, this is the one.
Very cool. Well, yeah, before I even mention it again, I've listened to, I started this morning, before we linked up, I started your album and, as I've been listening to it, it just sounds killer. The first track is, right out of the gates. It's like, it grabs your attention, which is, I think, pretty important as far as jazz recordings are concerned. So, everybody who hasn't so far, jump online and start streaming that, Elegant Traveler by Jocelyn if you haven't. So, well, yeah, that, as far as the instrument is concerned, I guess they could probably find out more on your website if they wanted to, or see any pictures or anything like that. But
Definitely. And on the Benedetto website, they have all the specs of it.
cool, cool. Well, yeah, that's one thing that I've, as I've been kind of navigating the guitar thing myself, that's something that I'm really into, is kind of like taking a middle of the road, like an Epiphone hollow body, and replacing the electronics and the components and actually getting a pretty sweet instrument out of it. So that's why I'm always curious about what's under the hood of instruments.
Yeah, yeah, that's fascinating. I know that that's something that I'll, get obsessed with at some point. It just hasn't hit me yet. But
Yeah,
maybe,
I think that I think that that's more of like maybe one of those things. It's for like whenever you're maybe in a situation where you can't afford to go to school, but you want
yeah,
to you want to do what you can to get the most information. The same thing goes. If you're not in a position to purchase a Benedetto or something like that, something along those lines, then you start to find ways that you could get the most out of what it is that you're working with, and that's one thing that I found. So
yeah, definitely, definitely.
learned a lot of pickup names and guitar electronic names along the way. So I was just curious.
No, that makes perfect sense.
Cool. Well, I've asked you enough questions and probed a little bit. So I just want to open it up for maybe you to talk a little bit maybe about your album, things that are going on with you musically or in your world of education. If you maybe want to talk about what your the guitar program at the university that you're at, so we could understand what's going on with you as far as education is concerned, so people could hear about, maybe auditioning for your program or what that might look like. Just open it up for you.
Yeah. Well, so a lot of things have happened kind of over a very short period of time recently. So
Yeah.
the last 8 months, so July, I got this instrument, started teaching as the head of the guitar department at Humber in September, which is Canada's biggest jazz program.
Mm,
So we have it sort of like, we've got the guitar department has about 80 guitar students in it, and about 10, I think nine guitar teachers.
wow.
Um, so stepping into this in September, as the head of the guitar department, has been just kind of a huge thing and I'm always like pretty nonchalant. I'm like, whatever, so I'll do the work. Then I'll make the spreadsheets, I'll do the work, and it'll be done. But then just
And everything will work itself out.
exactly, it's all be fine. Whatever, there's work to do. I can do work. Who cares?
Right.
Um, but sort of, especially over the last classes ended last week, and sort of over the last week, I've been like sitting around like, wow, that was a crazy year. I also recorded my first record in September, so putting out kind of in conjunction with starting this position, putting out my first record has been hugely rewarding, but also hugely, of course, like takes a lot of time.
Sure.
So those have been sort of and along the third thing that had been kind of massively time consuming was that I had booked a bunch of tours. I was supposed to do like a
Mm.
pretty extensive jazz festival tour next month, but of course that's being hopefully rescheduled for next summer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, so I'm sort of forgetting the question.
Oh, I was just opening it up for you to, just like you're talking about your program at Humber, and
Yes.
that in and of itself, that's pretty cool. So I guess that's almost the equivalent. It sounds like what you're doing in Canada would almost be the equivalent, I guess, in the U.S. of working at like the University of North Texas or something like that, where it's a pretty high profile university program or collegiate music program.
Yeah, it's sort of a similar model where there's, a lot of teachers, where sort of the model is to have like a lot of faculty who specialize in a lot of different areas,
Hmm.
and sort of have a big community of yeah, basically a big guitar community. And the guitar department is the biggest in the school. uh,
Wow.
so yeah, that's been awesome. It's been really challenging and really rewarding getting to know all of these young guitarists, and just sort of to I always like I knew what my musical values were,
Hmm.
and trying to now come up with ways to share them and convince. I'm sort of realizing that you can't just like force your musical values on students. You have to, or for me, it's like sort of presenting them, and it's all and inviting young people to kind of come along in the journey and the process. So just sort of starting to find ways of how can I pass my passion for Wes Montgomery and Grant Green and Joe Pass and George Benson and all of the guitarists that I love. How can I pass that on to the younger generation in a way that will excite them and make them want to study the same music? And it's just been really fun. My teacher Randy, uh, he said he wouldn't even remember this, but we were talking last year when I was kind of like juggling, like, should I leave New York? Should I like, I'm still young, should I really be like doing, moving into the education side of things before I feel, you know, like necessarily ready to,
Yeah.
um, in terms of like developmentally. And he's I'll just never forget this. He was like, as long as you're waking up every day and dealing with Bird, you're gonna be fine.
Ha, that's funny, man. That's funny. I'm actually in the process of working on his solo on Yardbird Suite. And I'm
Oh,
always, every time I approach Charlie Parker on the guitar, I'm like, God, man, this just does not lay well on the instrument. Like Donna Lee does not sit well on the guitar. And when you get inside of his phrasing, like it's Charlie Parker just does not sit well on the guitar. And that's one thing that I apologize for interrupting, but it's just something that
oh
just
no.
ties into what I'm up to musically. It's like you sit down with a Charlie Parker recording on the guitar and you're like, okay, that's clumsy, more clumsy. The way to execute this is just not guitaristic, right? So then for me personally, that's when I start to realize, like, okay, I don't always want to sound like a guitar player. So I listen to more horn players than I do. I listen to tons of guitar players, don't get me wrong, but it's like, okay, I don't just want to sound like jazz guitar player up the street. I want to have more horn phrasing under my fingers, right? So, and I admire horn players just musically. So when I try to apply a horn player's phrasing to the guitar, I find that it's not guitaristic. And so then that leads me to think, okay, I need to spend more time working with guitar players solos. Like, and then I start playing Wes's stuff and I'm just like, oh, I can hear it and immediately execute it on the guitar a lot easier because it's guitaristic stuff, you know? So yeah, dealing with Charlie Parker and horn players, especially as a guitar player, I think the challenge of that and the reason that people suggest it is because you start to see that the language maybe in order for you to execute it properly is going to require you to have a little bit more of a linear approach to the guitar rather than a horizontal approach, right? Because you're going to constantly, in order to execute that proper phrasing, you're going to be moving horizontally rather than vertically up and down on the guitar. So.
Mm-hmm. And something I can completely relate, that really resonated with me, you know, wanting to, you know, take horn, things that saxophonists and trumpet players are doing and put them on the guitar. How do you approach, because I'm still just trying to figure this out and I feel like I'm so clumsy. How do you approach like articulation? I struggle with that so much.
Man, well, that's for me personally, articulation didn't hit my radar until I was sitting down with I did my undergrad at the University of Arkansas. And I had two jazz band directors. The first jazz band director during like the first half of my undergrad was my guitar professor. So I kind of knew where he was coming from musically. He directed the big band and then we did our private lessons together, right? So he knew everything. He knew my guitar playing inside and out. We had like a good musical relationship. He kind of had one foot out the door. He was about to retire. So the second half of my undergrad, a saxophone professor took over the big band. And he and I actually he wound up playing saxophone in a gypsy jazz group that I made while I was doing my undergrad. And so we developed a really close musical relationship that was both colleague and professor, right? So at the end of my undergrad, I just said, hey man, I want to hang and talk and just, I want you to pick apart my playing so I can get an idea of some things that you're hearing that maybe aren't on my radar. And I think he already had answers ready. And he just said, hey man, let's think about phrasing. And I apologize, I have some background noise, so give me 1 second. I'm just gonna fix one thing.
No problem.
So he says phrasing, I don't think that you're thinking about phrasing. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You know, so he says, you know, if you think about the way that a lot of saxophone players are having the notes lay whenever they're putting their phrasing in, they're slurring from the upbeat to the downbeat. And I don't hear you doing that a lot. You're not slurring from the and to the downbeat whenever you're landing on a chord tone. And I just thought, okay. So then I started just to put that, and at first when I started doing it, it was real, felt really clumsy. And I almost felt like I sound, and I still to a certain degree, because I'm from Arkansas, I feel like a lot of times, kind of like you were saying in Canada, swing isn't maybe the native language. So for me, being an Arkansas native, sometimes I hear myself and I feel like it sounds like I'm playing country music. Which is really interesting. You know, it's like, oh, I even did this happen the other day. Like I was listening to a recording of myself with some friends and we're playing like Moose the Mooch, Billy's Bounce. We're playing some bebop tunes and I sound kind of like I'm playing country to a certain degree, right? And so this was also before that phrasing thing hit my radar. So that upbeat, going to the downbeat on the and is one thing that helped me a lot, but I started to like overdo it. It was almost like I was forcing it so much that I did the upbeat to the downbeat all the time, and it almost started to sound like real hokey.
Oh.
Okay, but that part right there, just knowing like, oh, holy cow, hearing that the saxophone players and horn players very often are slurring that upbeat to the downbeat, especially pushing it over the bar line. Like on the upbeat of beat 4 going to the downbeat of beat 1, when you're improvising or even trying to make a solo not sound so rhythmically clunky, that slurring that upbeat to the downbeat is one thing for me that opened up a big, I was kind of like, oh, whoa, okay. And then to refine that, of course, is kind of like what you're saying. In order to make it sound natural and come out in your playing, that's something that I'm still, like I took on my job here in Chicago Public Schools. So a lot of the stuff that I have been focusing on has kind of been put on a back burner, so to speak, musically. So I'm still working on that stuff. But another thing, whenever I was thinking about that phrasing that hit my radar, because I hand out that Aebersold jazz handbook to students a lot, especially beginning band students, so that they can start, my saxophone students. Like I have a bunch of kids in my beginning band at my school that I'm working at here in Chicago who would like to learn how to improvise that so far have not been given any of this information. So I just got a box of those Aebersold jazz handbooks, and I give them to them, and I start telling them, hey, work on these scales, yada, yada. But that Aebersold book actually has an entire page devoted to phrasing.
Wow.
All right. And it shows you, it illustrates perfectly a number of ways that you can approach phrasing and articulation to really stylistically embody what's happening with the music that is maybe not hitting our radar as guitar players. Because in order to execute some of those things, and I have to apologize right now for just like giving you, like taking the floor. But for me personally, that's one thing that I personally has been huge, is realizing like, holy cow, the way that you are going to phrase this stuff on the guitar is so just, it's almost counterintuitive. It's like the Charlie Parker thing. And so if you can look at it, that Aebersold book gives you a number of ways that you can start to practice phrasing. But then even sitting and then having that knowledge in the background, and then starting to approach different horn players and then seeing it on the guitar, and you start to find a different, I think that pushes you into that linear approach on the instrument rather than that horizontal, because we can get so caught up in just trying to keep things in a four fret span just for comfort and ease sake. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's really fascinating. I want that book.
Yeah, it's free. I mean, you could, and goes for listeners, I guess, at this point. You go to jamieabersold.com or whatever, and Jazz Handbook is free. As a matter of fact, any public school teachers, they'll send you a box of as many as you want. So
That's awesome. That's
yeah.
so great.
Yeah.
I found, even with, I'm just like living this Freddie Hubbard solo right now. So
can I tell you something actually that really stood out to me, because I saw that you posted that. I saw you posted a little clip of yourself playing that solo. And that was another thing that stood out to me. I think that oftentimes guitar players, if they're doing like a jazz trumpet solo, and you get to a point where you've run out of guitar because the trumpet's range is maybe a little bit beyond, right? That was cool that you took it down an octave.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So when it went up, you actually took it down. And I think a lot of people start to think, well, I'm out of guitar. What do I do? You want to learn how to apply this stuff. It's going to be out of the range. Take it down an octave. And you actually did that. That was pretty cool.
Oh, cool. That's, yeah, it makes sense. And also it just sounds cool in octaves.
Not only that, it sounded cool to have that octave being played while you were playing that lower octave. Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was very cool. It was like, the biggest struggle for me though was, so at first I transcribed it and I was just picking every single note. I even have a pick. I don't have a pick around here, or I would show you, but I was literally picking every single note, kind of in a, my Randy sort of calls it like a machine gun guitar playing, where it ends up being sort of like, and like I had to, and it was easier technically to do that.
Right.
Just pick every single note. But then when I took the solo away and played it on my own independently of the recording, it was like, oh, this isn't it at all. Like, this is not the sound.
Right. Yeah.
And so having to figure out, okay, well, now I have to do a bunch of pull-offs and figure out where I'm going to do that, how it's going to work, do a bunch of like hammer-ons, but like in the right places. And if it's in the slightly wrong place, then it sounds like all wrong.
Yes.
It's very challenging. It's very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really eye-opening to take one of those really good horn solos and execute them on the guitar, and then just kind of see like, oh wow, this is how I should be navigating this language on the guitar. But that's also a reason that I think that a lot of guitar players, like jazz guitar just sounds like jazz guitar, and a lot of the phrasing that's coming out of a jazz guitar player, it is completely unique in comparison to the horn player. So that's, for me personally, that's a really a personal thing that you're probably just going to have to come to, as far as everybody's concerned, we kind of have to come to grips with how are we going to balance that. But yeah, that's
Yeah,
one thing, just like you're saying, that you see, it's like, oh whoa, if I'm going to do this here and I'm going to connect it because things are moving. I don't have time to run up or down the fingerboard. So, in order to put it all together, it's kind of like, oh, whoa, this is a much larger task than it might look like.
definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
And as time, like just sort of as things progress, I find myself being like more and more like picky about such small little things. I'm finding like, oh, like if you actually listen to a bunch of the masters, like this is the detail that they got into.
Right.
It was,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
like
Yep.
none of it was by chance. Like Kenny Burrell, who to me is like the master of nuance, like he thought all of this stuff through. Like none of it was a coincidence.
Right. Right. And the thing is we just didn't see them sweat. We didn't see them put in that work. That was all secondary. Nobody heard. I mean, I'm sure people heard in practice, but that that's our job. Whenever we're learning this music, is to find those details for ourselves. Kind of dig in and find that. So yeah, that's cool. That's why I like having these interviews with also jazz guitar players as well as educators in other aspects, because I can whenever I'm talking with a jazz guitarist and a jazz educator, I have so much in common that I can just be like, oh yeah, really really share the floor, kind of.
It's so cool. It's such a cool like common language,
Yeah.
that you like you can relate so closely over these things with new people you've just met.
That's why I think that this is going to be so valuable, because I think that it was really going to illustrate that, like, everybody ultimately is kind of working. If this is what you're trying to do at any level, at some point you're going to be working on these things and thinking about these things. So to have an opportunity to really hear, kind of like in an organic fashion, how
Mhm.
people think about it and what they're doing. And just like you're saying, I mean, people are going to have an opportunity to hear a Benedetto endorsed artist who's also a performing jazz guitarist and educator talk about how they're still working some of these things out on the instrument and what they're thinking about. I think that that's going to be, people are going to take a lot away from that, especially as the episodes kind of continue to build up, because you're going to hear so many different responses to the same question. People say, this person said this and this, it's going to be kind of a cool storehouse of so much stuff. So
That's very cool. This is like super hip what you're doing.
I appreciate that. I think that it's really going to take off, and I the the way that it's going to look post is just, it's going to be cool. So
That's awesome. Very,
yeah.
very cool.
Yeah. Well, I would you, as far as I know, that ultimately we're kind of, everybody's on lockdown around the world, and most performing musicians um, don't know what the future looks like in terms of performances. But as far as, maybe something coming up in the fall, is for anything that you want to share in terms of stuff coming up musically that everybody might want to know about.
Yeah. Well, I'm was supposed to be recording my second record in June, but I think it's getting postponed. And I guess the next thing with all the postponements, the thing that hasn't been canceled yet is I'm really excited about it because it'll be my first time going to Europe. But I'll be doing a
Oh,
5 week run in Europe from mid October till late November. Uh,
wow.
I'm like, yeah, I really am just like, I heard Oktoberfest was canceled and a lot of the gigs are in Germany, so I'm just sort of like, oh, just kind of hoping it doesn't get canceled. But
Uh,
um,
Fingers
yeah,
crossed. Yeah.
pardon?
I said fingers crossed.
Oh, I'm just like, it's funny in terms of my like the progression of things for me. This is supposed to, and this was, and I'm not like trying to take a negative standpoint on it because I think it'll just be postponed a little bit. But this for me was going to be the time when I was just sort of coming out as a leader and getting to really start to tour and getting to start to do all of that. And I know it'll just,
It's
you
going
know,
to happen, there's no, yeah. So that is, regardless, and I hear you though. That just it so much. I mean, it's so hard to really even consider how big of an impact this has had on just everything. I mean, just every single aspect of day-to-day life has just been uprooted for the unforeseeable future. Like, we have no idea when things are going to kind of get back to what we consider to be normal, so ugh.
Yeah, so hopefully in the meantime I'll just be preparing for another recording and trying to write some music, and yeah, hopefully just hit the ground running when everything kind of gets going again.
Yeah,
Is
I
the
hear
hope.
you.
In the
I hear
meantime,
you.
I'm buying lots of people's albums online. I'm taking so much joy out of like just going and buying people's albums.
Wow, cool.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with what albums are you buying?
Well, albums, and also, people like go live and you can like Venmo them. For some reason, I'm like, this is what we should be doing. We should be Venmoing each other.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm sure you have, just because the kind of the circle of musicians that congregate around social media tends to kind of be the same. But a guy named Larry Tamanini out of
Yeah.
Philadelphia, jazz guitar player, released an album, I would say, within the last year or so that is worth checking out.
Oh, awesome. I
Yeah.
will I will buy it.
Yeah,
I will.
shout out to Larry there. I'm gonna get him on the show. He hosts a jam session in the Philadelphia area that has been kind of a mainstay for quite some time. So
Very
yeah,
cool.
yeah, cool. Another jazz guitar player.
Yeah.
Well, Jocelyn, I've eaten up. Let's see, I've eaten up an hour of your day. So
Not
once
even that.
again, I really, really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation. Uh, I if you have anything else that you want to share before we kind of wrap things up, I'd be happy to continue to leave it open for you.
I think that's it. I think I'm out of things.
Running out of gas. Cool. Well, if that's the case, then once again, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. I think that the listeners are going to get a lot out of our conversation, and I will on YouTube. I will be posting links to your website, to your Apple Music things, and everything. So, if we're on YouTube, you can check out all of the links to reach Jocelyn or hear her music or see what's going on with her tours on YouTube. And then I guess, Jocelyn, your personal website is jocelyngould.com,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, those are some places that you can find out what's going on with Jocelyn in the not too distant future. And again, thanks everyone for tuning in to the Jazz Education Station, and we will see you again in the next episode.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thank you.